Hello, can you hear me? Great. Okay. Now we're back to talk about modularizing the monolith, which is something that I've heard like lots over the years. Everybody talks about modularizing things and like breaking down the monolith into composable pieces and things like that. And then I've never understood how or why you would do that sort of thing until we got to the point at ProcurePro where we were like, oh, I feel like this is what we need to do. But like there was never any like concrete steps of like, actually, what do you do? There's like the whole idea of like, you know, you take part of your code, you put it over here and the other part over here, and you have some sort of like boundary around it. And like conceptually, I get that. But like what, like how do you actually go about that? And how do you get a team to do that? Because it's not like the way I think of modularizing is similar to microservices in that like the biggest problem it solves is like a people problem. How do you have more people working on the same code base or working on the same product and like not getting conflicts? Like sure, it's you get technical solutions, technical benefits of like having your code structured in a nicer way, but if your code base is that small or that simple that like you can work on it yourself as a single engineer, then you don't really need to modularize it. You can keep the whole thing in your head. The part where it started falling down from us is the code base gets so big that you can't keep it all in your head at one point, and you're hiring new engineers all the time who don't have that context in their head, and then they have to understand the whole code base to make any change. So just to sort of give you a bit of a background on us, in start of 2021, as COVID was sort of kicking off, we did a big pivot from our previous startup into ProcurePro, where we sort of like burned everything down and started again. We're at that point we had 4 engineers, including Tom and I, and I think I've got here. So at that point, the product was very, very simple. We had like a single thing that the product did. You could create a scope of works for a construction project, like you're building a hotel. You can create like a electrical scope of like, these are where I need all the wiring to be and that sort of stuff. There was like a single entity that you had to deal with, which is like a scope. We only had 10 pages in the whole product and we had 0 customers. So like we understood all of the code we'd ever written. It was very easy to keep in your head. Fast forward to the end of 2023, when we sort of came to this modularization realization, and like we had, like we sell our product as having 3 core modules, but when you break it apart technically, there's actually more like 5, maybe even 8 of like big meaty sections. Like some of these sections are like complex enough that they could be entirely separate products. There's like really complex configuration for all of our customers to get set up. There's over 60 pages, and at that point we had 80 customers. I think we just hit like 120 the other day, which was nice. But like what we could see at the end of 2023 was like we weren't feeling any pain yet, but you look forward and you're like, this is only going to get bigger. It's only going to get more complex. We're only going to get more engineers. Like, how do we keep this growing and not have it become really hard to kind of maintain and manage? 170. Oh, wow. That's way higher than I thought. Go us. So over this whole timeline, we had like something that didn't change was our product process, right? So from the time when there was just 4 of us up until when we had 11 engineers spread across 3 teams, like our product process was the same. We're like founders, me and Tom and our other founders were largely defining all the features and then giving it to a team. So you implement that piece, you implement that piece. We built it like really high fidelity designs, like breaking down every little thing that can happen on the screen. And then the engineers are just like, take this design, write code, ship it to production. But we would involve the teams in that scoping process, how long that's going to take, because like we learned the hard way that if we tell them how long it's going to take, we're always wrong. But then like the issues that we had with this process was like the releases started to slow down. As we're getting more teams, we're getting more people, the product's getting bigger, we start shipping things just slower over time. You look at like the rate of shipping at the start of 2023 to the end of 2023. The start of 2023, we're shipping big features every couple of weeks. The end of 2023, you might get 1 a month. the architectural complexity of the whole system is growing. You have to think about more things in order to build something, which I'll get into like a more concrete example in a sec. Because the core problem was like the team had to understand like a large part of the product in order to make any simple change. And like, don't get me wrong, the house wasn't on fire. Like we had really good test suite, really good static analysis tools. Like we have a lot of guardrails so that the teams can't break things in production. You can't accidentally ship something that burns the whole site down. But like, it's still really slow to develop something new because you have to go and touch so many different parts of the system. This is a slide I ripped from our sales deck, kind of explaining our overall platform, which is you've got like, these are all essentially like parts of the platform where on a construction project, you have a procurement schedule, which is all the different trades that you need to procure to build, say, your hotel, concrete, electrical, your tapware and finishes and that sort of stuff. For those, you build a scope of works, all the things you need to do. Then you go out to tender, you get people to send back quotes of how much they would charge to do that as a subcontractor. You compare all those quotes, then you pick one, do an approval process, generate a contract, send it out for signing, and then you have just like this other bit on the end of it where you're sort of like managing all your vendors and you get some analytics over like how well you performed, are you above budget, are you ahead of time, that sort of thing. So like, there's a lot in there. That took us many years to build up, and like having to consider all of those different parts in order to make a change, like this, for example. On the left here is the procurement schedule, which is essentially just a list of all your trades. On the right is a page from like when you're inside a trade, you have our 3 core modules, which is scope, choosing your vendor, which is like tendering and approvals and stuff, and generating a contract. But you can see like some of the data out of the vendor selection module gets pulled out and is displayed on your procurement schedule, which is like which vendor you've selected and the budget that you've assigned. And then these little traffic light symbols on the side here are essentially a quick status into each of those modules. Like what's the status of it? Green is like it's approved, it's all sorted, this is done. Orange is like it's in progress or it's pending approval. And then there's none in that screenshot. Oh, there is a couple of gray ones, which is like you haven't started this yet. So there's like all of these different areas of the system, and there's data being like pulled out, particularly into the procurement schedule. It has its fingers in every single pie, right? So if you're as an engineer, you want to make a change to that procurement schedule. If you want to change those traffic light symbols, you've got to understand like the core workflows inside each of those modules in order to make that change. And conversely, if you're an engineer working in the vendor selection module and you want to change the approval process, you might inadvertently break the procurement schedule without realizing that, like, you know, if you change the way that workflows work, add a new step in or a new status, then all of a sudden the procurement schedule doesn't work as it should. That was kind of the core problem that we were trying to solve. And like, just to sort of explain a little bit more about like why modularization sort of came to mind. If you think about like the overall data architecture, you've obviously got a project and it has many trades on it, which is where the procurement schedule up here comes from. You can jump into a singular trade. You've got your 3 core modules. I'm just going to dive into vendor selection because like just to try and simplify things a little bit, but the same thing applies, like I said, to the other modules. They have their own internal approval processes and data and stuff as well. If we look inside vendor selection, right, you have a list of vendors. So Full Buckets, whatever that was, this is the vendor name, Full Buckets and Diggers, different earthworks vendors. They've got a quote. You've selected Full Buckets as like the vendor of your choice because their quote was cheaper or for whatever reason. Then you have to start an approval workflow. So you're a contract administrator, you've selected the vendor, but you need to get sign off from your project manager, from your commercial manager to make sure that like you've done your due diligence, you've picked the right vendor. Workflows might be cancelled and restarted for whatever reason. So you've got a list of workflows on there. Each workflow then has a list of sequential steps. It's assigned to a person. You're waiting on that person to approve it. Now the next step, which has not yet been actioned or doesn't have an outcome yet, is now like the current step. So another one, that's it. So that's sort of like to put that little traffic light on the procurement schedule, you have to come into the vendor selection module. You have to find, is there a workflow currently active? You have to go into that workflow. You have to look at all the workflow steps and be like, are they all approved? Is one not approved? That sort of thing. If you kind of put it out on like a bit of an ER diagram, it looks relatively straightforward, right? Project has a few trades, which has a vendor selection, has multiple workflows, which each have workflow steps, and you got a few vendors. But no, this is not the side I thought it was going to be.
It was a real like swing and get it out of the bottom. Shit, there's no slide there.
What you want to think about though, the bit that where it gets complicated is thinking about like how the data actually flows through the system. And there's this guy called Melvin Conway who is, I don't know, some old white guy, I assume. And he has this law that says an organization will always design a system that mirrors the communication structure within inside that organization, right? You can apply that to technical teams like this, right? If you have an organization that has a lot of small distributed teams, they will just most likely design a modular architecture with their sets. But if you have kind of like a large big team that sort of does everything, you end up in this like monolithic architecture where everything has got its fingers in every pie. Everyone understands everything. Everyone works amongst every single thing. And that's what we had, right? Even though we had 3 teams, every team worked on every part of the code base. And features were assigned to teams based on who had the most availability. Like, oh, you're about to finish a feature, here's the next feature for you to work on. So you'll be jumping from scopes into vendor selection, onto the procurement schedule. You have to understand everything.
But it sounds like this is organizational problem rather than software development or engineering problem.
Exactly. And that's sort of
because it's enough to divide your entities with namespaces and say, okay, you are working on scopes only, and you are working on vendors or whatever.
Yes,
that's it.
That's kind of where I'm getting to. Yes, but the problem still is then like if you're the team working on vendor selection, you want to make sure the team working on procurement schedule isn't coming into your vendor selection and like breaking your workflows. And also, while you're working on vendor selection, you want to make sure that any change you do, you want to know that it's not going to break anything else, but you don't want to have to think about the way things are consuming your module. And the way I think about it is like a public API, right? You're integrating with like Stripe or Facebook or something like that. Stripe doesn't need to know exactly how you're using their API and like the internals of your product. And you don't need to know how Stripe builds their public API. But both parties work towards this like common contract in the middle where like, I know these endpoints are going to be available and they're going to return this data. So I don't really care what you do behind the scenes and vice versa. And I think, as you said, like when you get your different teams, you want that like contract between them all so that they can all be sure that they're not going to break the other person's stuff and that they don't have to worry about the other person's stuff when they're doing stuff as well. So yeah, jumping back, like thinking about the data flow, as I said, if you want to be able to figure out, like if you're on the procurement schedule, you're the engineer working on the procurement schedule, you want to figure out how to display that little traffic light, you've got to like go into vendor selection, you've got to go down to the workflow, you've got to go to the workflow step, check the status on all the workflow steps. If all the workflow steps are approved, then you can go and get the selected vendor and you can display that information. And if any of that fails, then you just display nothing because it's not approved yet. That's actually pretty simple code to write, like 10 lines of code, put it in an array all loop from the brand new, is that PHP 8.3 or something?
It's not actually code.
If all the steps are approved, then great, our vendor selection is approved, and then you can just get the selected vendor. It's not that hard code to write, but you still have, like, in order to write that, you have to understand the internals of how workflows work. And it's actually like a fair bit more complicated than that. I am simplifying it a bit for a 20-minute talk. But this is like this part of the graphic from before. Like we did have like this large team, everybody knows everything, so people just go to the thing that's easiest. Like I don't want to have to, like I know that this workflow exists over here and they have steps, I'm just going to get them all and check what I need. Just kind of what you default towards is the easiest, the path of least resistance. But like the issues with this is you have, like I said, you have to understand the workflows in vendor selection in pretty great detail. And if you're in vendor selection and you want to change the approval process, you might break the procurement schedule, because an example of what we did do was we had those steps where you had a single user on each step, like one after the other. But what happens if one of those users is away? Or what happens if there's like 2 project managers and you want either of them to be able to approve it? So now you want to be able to add multiple users onto that step. How does that change your data model? And then if you do that, does it break your procurement schedule? Does it break something else? But then a bigger issue for us as well was like a new engineer comes in, they have to understand all that context around workflows and stuff to work on the procurement schedule, which we heard time and time again from new engineers of like, there's just so much domain content that I have to learn and understand. I just feel so slow, like I'm figuring stuff out. And they're all, like I said, they're all comfortable. They're not going to break things with all the tests, but it's still really slow. And it's just like a bit of a shit experience for new engineers to come in and just like feel really slow when they might have come from another company where they understood everything and they're really fast. So then there's this concept of like building that, the fence, the boundary between your teams, right? Between your modules is like, you want to have this concept of better fences make better neighbors. If you have a good fence around your modules, then all your modules sort of interact nicely instead of like reaching in and touching all the internals of the other modules. And there's obviously like a technical concept of that, like defining the boundary, choosing which data you expose from your module, and like building contract tests so that you know that you are only exposing what you want in a way that other people can consume. But then there's the people aspect of that as well, of like, as a person, as an engineer working in that module, I need to understand what's in this module and I need to meet my contract on the outside. I don't need to care about how the procurement schedule uses that. And I know that people on the procurement schedule are going to come in and break my code that I just wrote last week, sort of thing. So then you get like a little bit nicer of a graph that looks like this, where you've got like private internal state of like your trade and your vendor selection and stuff like that. And then you have these like defined paths that you can like fetch data from the core module or procurement schedule can like say, give me the status of the vendor selection or give me the selected vendor, but I don't care how that happens. And all that is controlled by the vendor selection module, which again is just like pretty easy, right? It's just good software engineering. Do like dry sort of solid principles where you just like define a function that returns the thing. It's very easy to just make a service that does that thing for you and people could call that. There's a couple of problems with that though that we came across. One was like enforcing that boundary. Like how do you force or ensure that every engineer is actually going to call this service? Like what happens when they want to do something a little bit different? What happens if the procurement schedule also wants to show like what user you're waiting on for the approval? And that's not part of your contract that you've defined. Are they going to like go and update your like vendor selection module service to be like, hey, I'm going to expose the users now? Or are they just going to like reach in and grab it because they know that code, they only wrote it last week? And that's where sort of Conway's law comes into it of like, if all your teams are still working on everything and you don't have like nicely defined teams that work on a particular part of the product, it's just gonna, eventually it's gonna end up back there anyway. But also exposing your like underlying domain entities, like a trade or a vendor, just immediately breaks the contract because your entities have getters that get other things.
So it's like doctrine entities in particular. Like these are database models that you can load through relations. It's like once you have access to that, you have the raw. It's basically like you have access to basically the raw database table. So like your raw internals.
Exactly. So you get your trade, and you can just say, get me the project from here. Get me the user that created this trade. Get me the scope from the trade as well. And you can sort of just cross the module boundaries really easily without going through whatever contract you've defined. Does that make sense? Am I losing anybody?
These are typical steps which takes place when you want to migrate to a proper microservice, because what you're talking and what you're trying to teach, like code-based law, is the stuff which is typically sold by software architects who are trying to say that your application must use microservices if you want to hire 30, 40, 50 plus developers.
Yeah.
And these are very simple, not simple, very typical stuff. And,
Yeah. It's very similar to microservices in the fact that like microservices have like a very clear boundary between the different things. I think going from a monolith straight to microservices is really hard. I think you have to go through modularizing, build that boundary, and then maybe at some point you could take out vendor selection and put it in another service somewhere. The benefit of keeping it as like a modular monolith is you can left join shit when you need to. You can't left join across entirely separate databases in different regions of the world. Like you have.
That's a very interesting question. Like if you are pitching the idea that you're going to use the same database for this modular software, then it will lead you to duplicated requests and to joins which could be avoided in monoliths, but will be essentially take place in modular software. Because in microservices, you have to duplicate a lot of stuff. You have to duplicate some user information, but which is only actually required by your module, by your service. You have to listen further and to discuss once.
We'll keep going. But it's a very similar concept going to microservices versus doing modularization. It's all largely solving a similar problem.
If you're in the code though, you're in the code that's not being pulled out to a separate microservice. So you're the one that's still in the monolith, and your friend is going out to the microservice. You're still going to go through the same journey of like having this.
I went this path, exactly this path.
I'm sort of saying like just from the perspective of like with like the situation we were in, already had a big code base, and you kind of see where it's going long term. If we were to say to help manage our teams, we would like this to be separately deployed, separate repo and stuff like that, so they can manage this independently. To everyone else in the main code base, they have to go through like some sort of journey that looks like this, because you can't join database entities anymore. You have to go through a service layer. The difference is basically if it was a like true microservice that's going through HTTP, gRPC, something like that, and we're just calling different PHP function. But for us in the main code base, we still have to get our shit in order. And so this is kind of like the stepping stone to getting our shit in order. So that option is there if we need it.
Are you going to introduce independent databases for each module or not?
Not at this point, but like that's an option at some point. If we want to split out databases, if we want to split out microservices, like the point is once you have your module well defined with the boundaries around it, those are options that are available to you, which are not available when everything's sort of interconnected.
My advice then to have separate entity managers for separate modules. That will prepare you,
so you
a lot.
Prevents the join. That would be a step to take if we decided we wanted to split something out into a microservice for sure. But yeah, like you said before, the thing you can do is just separate your teams, put a team on scopes, put a team on vendor selection. This is actually called the reverse Conway maneuver, which was coined by Uncle Bob, whatever his name is, another old white guy, Robert Martin. He coined this term after
technology history, but
it's all largely old white guys. So anyway, which is just like you said, you have it instead of worrying about like the technical part, you just like put a team on the core of procurement schedule, put a team on vendor selection. The teams then focus on the thing that they own. They get continuity of work. If they know they're always working in vendor selection, they're going to just naturally start building those boundaries around what they own. because they know they're not going to have to go and jump into like scopes or something else next week. Because then they're incentivized to build those boundaries around what they own. They're incentivized to like clean up and improve the code that they're always going to be working in, because they know they're going to be working in it for a long time, not like jumping off to like the next feature on the other side of the product. Yeah, so I'm going to go even deeper now into some more like specific steps of what we did. The first thing you have to do is like obviously organize the code. So this is kind of sort of what our code looked like. You have like your source folder, you have a bunch of entities, and all the entities are in that one folder. You have a bunch of services and controllers, and sort of, again, all of them are in the same folder. Your procurement schedule, your vendor selection stuff. You've got tests at various different levels, which are, again, all kind of every functional test for every part is like in the same place. So how do you actually move them around? How do you group these up? And the concept that you think about is like code that changes together lives together. So again, you create a module. So we have a new folder called modules. You have vendor selection underneath that. And then the folder structure underneath that is essentially the same as what the root folder structure used to look like. You've got source, you've got tests, you've got your entities and your controllers and your services. And just everything under here is related to vendor selection.
Why not on the SRC?
You could.
You have already core, which is a generic module or common module. So why not to put into SRC?
The main reason was everything under the source module had the root namespace of Hira from the previous company that we had before the pivot. And I didn't like looking at the name of our dead company all the time. So I created a new... Hey? Hira IQ, there it is. Look at that. I should get rid of that, shouldn't I?
It's also just like the old code versus the new code, because it's like move all the shit in like a couple of PRs. It's like over the month stuff gets moved. So you have like the new stuff lives in this place at a higher standard, and we know this stuff lives there, and the teams keep sort of gradually working towards it in that way. Also, you can just put files wherever you want.
You can just do whatever.
No one's going to take into court over what your folders are.
There's a couple of benefits you get of like, I'll show like right at the end, I show like how we're tracking the progress through modularization, and like, because you can essentially just count the files in modules and count the files in source and be like, we're 30% of the way there. Whereas if you put another folder underneath source, you have to say, count the folders underneath like source, new stuff, and then count everything that's not that sort of thing. Just a bit harder. But yeah, and you can also use CI tools to enforce higher standards on the modules folder, essentially. Turns out this is actually really easy to do. In Composer.json, you just define a new namespace, and then in your IDE, click and drag, and the IDE just does everything for you. It takes your namespaces, and it takes all your use statements, and it just changes them for you. So we often have PRs now that are like thousands of lines long, and all it is someone's gone and selected 100 files, dragged them to a new folder, create PR, and that's fine.
Wow. And you completely missed the one line that they changed because you just went,
you just
that's why
That's the ATO backdoor, yeah.
yeah.
No, they have to be separated. When you move the code, you create the PR just to move the code.
Exactly.
Like rename, only rename, move, only move.
And then subsequent PRs, you start restructuring.
Rename and one small bug fix.
Yeah.
It's a mixture user authentication. It'll be fun.
nice man from in the dark suit really wanted to authenticate his end user.
So then the second problem is, like I said, exposing our like doctrine entities, which then essentially let you break the contract because you can jump to wherever you want in the code base. So in doctrine land, and it's very similar in Laravel land as well, like you have your entity, that's a trade, have a property on it, you define your database relationship, like it's a join from vendor selection onto trade, from trade onto vendor selection. There's this like bidirectional relationship between your two entities, and they like directly relate. And like under the hood, you are on your trade and you say get vendor selection, it does a database left join and returns that as a model. You want to prevent that. So you can define interfaces like this. So you make your trade, implement an interface, you make your vendor selection, implement an interface, although my vendor selection is implemented trade interface. Forget about that. But the idea is, instead of having a trade directly on your vendor selection, you have a trade interface. And on a trade, you have your vendor selection interface, which only lets you get the selected vendor and the status. And you're not allowed to get the workflow that's underneath the vendor selection. And that is part of the way that you define the contract between the two things, so that you can hide your internal details. Not sure how that works under the hood in other frameworks, but in Doctrine, they have this resolve target entities property where you just define the interface, you define the concrete entity that it points to, and then Doctrine just figures everything else out. It just works out of the box from there.
It allows you to, in your code for your static analysis, it thinks that everything is just interfaces, but actually at runtime it's the real concrete one. So you could, but you'd have to take this trade interface in your code and cast it to being concrete and disable a bunch of CI checks to get around it. But it's enough to feel like it has the same rules.
If you were going,
Do you really need something apart from just IDs?
well,
Why are you passing the whole object?
that was an option that we turned up as well. You could just take vendor selection off here and just put a string of vendor selection ID, and then you'd pass that ID into things. The main reason we went with this is because there's less code changes. You can create this interface and then plug it in and everything works. Whereas if we remove this property, you have to go and drop a column off the database, or add a new column to the database, or just remove a referential integrity constraint. And then you have to go and update the code to always go and do extra select statements and stuff like that.
Yes, extra
just more work.
statements obviously will take place because
Yeah.
That's module. That's the idea of module, and application will happen. I wanted to, sorry.
Yep, you're right.
Biggest offenders were not the scalars on the relationship. So going from a vendor selection to get the trade names and thing, that's a string on that property. The biggest offenders was walking the tree of going relationships.
Yes, I get it. That's entirely unacceptable. But even passing the object is actually not needed for the
Yeah, but
modules.
the point though is we're not building something from scratch. We've got a big existing code base, and so if we have to refactor large amounts of the code base to change everything during the user IDs, that makes it harder to make any changes. But if we can go a little bit step a little bit further, so you can't go through all the relationships, we can have a more widespread impact of that rather than making one small group.
The other thing is an integer or a string ID can be anything. You don't have any ability to do CI checks or static analysis to make sure that that is actually an entity.
You could accidentally pass a trade ID into a call that's meant to take a vendor selection ID, and there's nothing to stop you doing that, which is a problem that we wanted to avoid.
Parking ID integers as being an integer of this particular type.
Oh, no need. You create a dummy ID object, and even if it's actual wraps int, but you pass that object.
We're definitely not at the end of this modularization journey, as you'll see at the end of the slide deck as well. We're still doing stepping stones on the way to being a fully modularized code base. And then probably once it is modularized, you start to do more things, you do rip off that entity entirely, and you have a model, or you have a string ID wrapped in a type safe object or whatever, so that you can break it up even further. But you need stepping stones to get there. We still have to keep running a business. We still have to keep shipping product. We can't just tools down. We're going to refactor everything to use IDs
No
for
need to refactor
months.
everything, just one bit and it's another one. Okay, and why do you need then to map entities in Doctrine to interfaces? As long as you want to receive only essentially read-only object, why do you need to make the stuff with the Doctrine? Why do you need to configure it?
Why you need that?
What are you doing with this one? Yeah.
Because Doctrine, I don't know how Eloquent or anything other works under the hood, but Doctrine sees this property and it knows, when it's vendor selection, it knows I have to go and select off this other database based off the type. And then that's all that does. It just tells it that when you see a vendor selection interface, under the hood, its concrete implementation is vendor selection, and that's how it just knows what table to join on when it needs to.
You need to make this tab and oh.
So am I losing you?
Okay, yeah, probably I get an idea. Because you're saving in your module relation to other module.
Yes, but you are defining explicitly which relations are exposed from your module and which are not. So you can choose to expose from vendor selection.
Yes, I get the idea, but still you are saving some other module entities in your end.
Yeah, well, because before we didn't have modules, everything was already saving everything. We've got to get to a point where we can break those lines, right? So this is the stepping stone to do it. Like, you still have those relationships in the database level, but at the code level, you can prevent people traversing them. You can like make the code clean without having to change the underlying database as a first step.
And also you can, in the future, if you need to change how one particular entity is stored, so it's no longer stored in that database, if you're just handing interfaces around, it doesn't matter what the underlying storage is. So long as it meets the interface, it doesn't matter if it actually comes from Doctrine or if it's in Redis or if it's
exactly
from an API.
That's obvious. That's obvious. I was asking only about Doctrine configuration.
This is just so, yeah, Doctrine can find it. I don't even know if that's necessary if you're using a different ORM. But that's just what we have to do.
I mean, it's required because you're making association in your module entity with some bodies else with some other modules entity, even though it's represented as an interface, but essentially you save it into your
yes.
It's in the database. It's a table, and I would call the foreign key to another table that is not from your module.
You can technically step in as this foreign key, and that's it. That will work as well, but you will not have this relation association maintained by Doctrine, and that will look like more proper microservice. But probably that's just another next step for you.
Exactly. You have to have stepping stones to get there, right? The other part is, like I said, you obviously want to have not just entities, but there's like services that you want your module to be able to expose that other modules can call. So the way we went around that, which is not technically the best way of doing it if you read blog posts on the internet, but we did anyway, was we just have a public folder inside our module, and anything inside that public folder, other modules are allowed to call, but anything not inside there is disallowed. So your core module, we're on the procurement schedule service. Currently, it's going to the workflow service in vendor selection to figure out what the status is and to get the selected vendor and things like that. And it's not allowed to do that. Or you don't want it to do that. How do you stop it? How do you find all these places that are doing that so you can have a hit list of places to update? And then how do you prevent new code being written from now on to like not just go and grab the workflow service because I know it exists and it's easier than like going and updating this vendor selection module public thing. And in code, how that works, how that looks currently is you've got your procurement schedule service and it just has the workflow service injected into it. And the change that you want to see is instead you inject the vendor selection module in and you use that instead. So how do you get there? The tool we found, DepTrack. Have you heard of DepTrack before? Yeah. There's plenty of tools that help you like enforce some sort of like architectural level constraints. So the DepTrack aligned with what we're thinking is in that you define layers of your code. Like everything that is in like the core namespace is the core layer. Anything that's in the vendor selection namespace is in the vendor selection layer. And by default, when you run DepTrack, it'll just give you a shitload of violations because things are reaching between your modules and it shouldn't be allowed to. Reaching between your layers, to use their terminology. So then you define a rule set to say, if you're in the core, you're allowed to depend on the vendor selection module. And then that allows some of those relationships to exist. And then the other part of this is there's two parts to these layers. One is anything in the core is private, which means even if it's in the rule set, you're not allowed to depend on it. But then anything that's in this public namespace, that's not private. So when we define this rule set, that's saying that the core layer is allowed to go into the vendor selection layer, and it's allowed to get anything that's in this public namespace, but not everything else in the module. So then you end up with a sort of overall diagram that looks like this, where calls into the vendor selection module are allowed, calls into the workflow service are not. And then you run this and you get like hundreds of violations because you've got hundreds of places that are reaching into the workflow service, which then leads to the next problem. How do you actually roll this out? You've now got a CI tool that fails. Can't have that because then no one can merge code. And it's also really hard to make it pass, right? It's super easy, like I said, to drag your files into the new modules folder. Your IDE does all the work for you. But then the hard part is, like we've been talking about, is you got to go through all of your entities and you got to update them to use interfaces. Everywhere that calls your entity, you got to go and change them to like probably call a service now, and so that it's not crawling the entity tree. You've got to go and change all the places that are injecting the workflow service to inject your new public module service, and call different methods and whatever. And you'll undoubtedly find places that are touching stuff that they certainly shouldn't be touching. So then you've got to go and define new public services to expose different data in a different way. That's really hard. It takes a really long time. And at the end of the day, you just want to see progress on this. Like you can spin your wheels on this. And we did for like 3 months, sitting there making no progress on modularization because we're trying to figure out like, how the fuck do you even define a module? The solution we came to was just make a baseline. Move the code, get the code into the modules folder. You get 100 violations, put them in a baseline. That track gives you a baseline, and then you just say, that's fine. They can fail for now. But from here on, any new code in that modules thing has to follow our new rules. They can't get added to the baseline. And then also you have this nice baseline, which is a hit list for you. Like when you have a spare minute, go to the baseline, grab a thing that's violating our new module rules and update it so it's using the new system. And I think that's it. At the last part, you have a bit of bonus and you can track progress. So like I said, simple script here that just counts the number of files in source, counts the number of files in modules, dump that to a CSV file, feed that into a BI tool, and we get this pretty graph that shows how much code we have that's not modularized, and that's slowly trending down, and how much code you have that is modularized, and that's slowly trending up. And as you can see, we're 30% over the way through. And every quarter, we set a new goal of like, okay, we want to be 6% or 10% ahead for the next quarter. Let's keep ticking this along. While we're still adding violations, everything's still like breaking our new rules, we are getting our code into the modules. And the next step, maybe I'll do another talk in a year's time, when you start going back and ticking off that hit list in depth track to actually properly follow your new rules and respect the boundaries. And then maybe after that, you start being like, all right, now we have boundaries. Let's rip this out into a microservice for reasons. Like the world's your oyster. Once you have like a properly defined modular architecture, you can just sort of do whatever you want. But it's a long process to get there. And you want to do it without like feature freezes or anything like that. You don't want to do a full rewrite. All these things are bad, and I've heard terrible horror stories from various people who've tried to do them. So we're trying to do it in a nice, consistent way where every week you do a little bit of it and you slowly tick towards a goal and you get there without having to burn the world down as well. I think that's it. If you don't know me, you can scan my LinkedIn QR code and add me. But does anybody have any questions on that? Yes.
So a while ago, James did a similar talk about domain-driven development.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, we were really aggressive in adopting DDD. And a couple of learnings. So one of the things that we did was when we generate a new domain, we'd have 100% code coverage, good unit test coverage. Some of the niceness that you can introduce and so forth, while you're writing new code as well. How are you foreseeing dealing with sub-modules? If a module gets a little bit too beefy, would you, for example, have module X and then actually just create module Y, which is very similar to module X? It's just basically getting a bit too beefy. How would you break down a module at that point?
The way we've done it is like we actually do have sub-modules under here. So like under source, instead of going directly to entity, you would have like workflow, and underneath workflow you would have entity, and it's just using namespaces. It's nothing fancy, but it gives you that ability for like vendor selection might have 3 or 4 sub namespaces. I just trimmed it out for simplicity.
Between a top level domain or module, the rules, how they interact with each other, how does that change then between sub modules inside a top level module?
For the moment, we've just said sub levels inside a module can do whatever they want.
That's exactly what
with
we did as
inside their
well.
module, just to keep it easy. So you've got a smaller step. At a certain point, you can still do this same depth track thing and just do it for like the next level down as well. So you can have more layers. Your depth track, our depth track file is like 300 lines long. Like it gets big, and it will get complicated. I don't know how you like actually maintain that with like a large code base if you've got lots of sub modules, but gotta find out.
Yeah, I don't think it'd be a particularly bad pattern to have. So you have parent and 2 children, and like they're too complex. It's why like they need to be broken into sub modules. That parent module acts as like a gateway for the other ones that can go through. So you enforce like those can't go into children. I think that's like a reasonable thing to enforce, but you do have to ask yourself at some point: does it still make sense to have like essentially a gateway module for those, or are they, if they're that big, are they genuinely actually 2 domains that are separate?
Well, you do need to, in my opinion, be quite contractually, I guess, strict at the top domain level, making those service classes maybe a little bit more complex, at the benefit of having that domain able to stand still and no spaghetti coming in or out, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Another question I had. I think you had a question.
I'll give you some time.
Yeah.
Knowing what you know now, if you can go back to when you were 10 pages, would you do this in hopes of reaching where you are today? Or would it have been just overkill when you were trying to get your 10 pages right? Like, is it a matter of this is clearly how we should have been from the start, or it was unimportant overkill over architecture back then, and there was a milestone where it became necessary? How do you determine have you grown in your decision making because of this?
Yeah.
That if you were to make another completely new project, would you go, we're doing this, guys, from the start? I would have this from the start. Yeah.
I tried to do it from the start with just like PHP namespaces, and I had like just like a rule of thumb in my head, like things in this namespace I'm allowed to use and things in that namespace I'm not. And then that worked when I was the only one writing backend code. And then we got 10 engineers, and then I'm looking and I'm like, that wasn't meant to be used anywhere else, and you're using it, and there's no way to like properly share the thoughts that are in my head. Like this allows you to codify and enforce it. I don't think this would actually be that much work. And as engineers, Tom and I have always erred towards like putting in more work up front. So like from the early days, we went ham on tests and static analysis and other AI tools, knowing that it slowed us down when we had those 10 pages.
Yes.
But it's allowed us to continue that same velocity, and we don't slow down as the code base gets larger, as the team gets larger. We have a little bit, it's kind of the subject of this talk, but not as much as I've seen in previous companies where like everything largely grinds to a halt because you're fighting fires every day. Every day you've got 10 customers on the phone being like, oh, this thing broke for me because you did an update yesterday. And you've got your sales team and your CS team trying to like veto you doing deploys because it breaks their demos or it breaks for their customers. And you're like, I don't want to deal with that, man. So like from day one, we put in a lot of effort to like have tests and static analysis and like good code quality and stuff, which goes against the grain. a lot of people will tell you when you're starting a startup, like cut corners, ship bugs, like write shit code. You can sort it out later when you have money. But our view is the one thing that's constant in a startup is change. You know you're going to learn things. You know stuff is going to change and it's going to break your previous assumptions and you're going to have to rewrite large parts of your code base. If you're going to have to do that, I'd fucking prefer to have a lot of tests around it so I know I'm not breaking anything when I'm doing like large scale changes across the whole system.
Because from like a architecture bit, so the testing bit's important, kind of come back to the end of what I'm saying here, but like the architecture piece by itself, it is more work to do than to not do it, that's for sure. But I think probably the thing that is actually hardest about it, which you'd know from D2D sort of things, is what the fuck is my boundary? What is the domain? Where does it start? Where does it stop? And that's probably the thing that you would hurt most when you're like using and trying to employ this like from day zero in a project, because you're probably being overzealous on drawing boundaries. But the right way to use it would probably be to keep everything in kind of one module and a boundary until you go, like, that really doesn't make sense. I can instinctively know those two things shouldn't be known about each other. And then you go, it's later than I probably wanted to have done this, but it's still earlier. And we kind of knew this because we did have namespaces in and Symphony and stuff. They were trying to organize the code, but it was a mess because you're still learning. We were learning the construction. We're still learning how our product evolves, and it changes a lot from what we thought it would do as what it actually does. And so like some of these start to crystallize some of those views or assumptions of the domain you have. Like, they don't make it harder and impossible to change per se, but you might spend probably more calories thinking about what was in this module versus that one when it might not be super important. But I think there's a line between doing this from day one and the point that we started doing this, where we probably should have been about halfway that we should have started doing this. There was like some pretty clear like writing on the wall sort of moments of it. And ironically, coming back to the testing bit, the testing is actually probably the thing that hurts the most about this. So when you write a fuckload of tests, it takes a long time to run in the CI. And the thing that would be really good is if you had engineers who only touch this part, only run their tests. That gets really hard to do effectively at scale if you don't have good module separation. Because if you don't know, if I'm making changes to this code base, who is this module, who depends on me? Because if I make changes here, I kind of need to run those things as well to see if those are broken. And if you don't have your dependency analysis to work that out, you basically need to run the entire test suite, which is fine when you're starting. It's fine when you've got 10 database records, like 10 database entities. Kind of sucks when it's like 300. So that's kind of the thing that I think I've probably learned is like halfway along where we probably should have been like, yeah, we kind of need more of this, because we could start to see as the team's growing, they'll want to have things separate so that a team can independently like life cycle this whole thing to production.
So if you start a new product at ProcurePro, a separate product not attached to this, would you start in this way now?
Yes, but not in PHP. So I'm currently literally doing this, and it's in Nest.js. And so Nest.js is actually basically this baked into the framework. And Nest.js is only really the Symfony dependency injection component as a framework. It's all it really does is a DI framework, and then you like bolt on Express basically to do the PHP controllers. But it has the first classes in its dependency injection container the concept of a module, and the module has services that lives inside it, and it has imports of things that it wants from external, and it has exports of things that it publishes outside of it. And that's like kind of baked into, you can't avoid it. Like you get compiler errors essentially of you're depending on something that you haven't explicitly imported. So it feels like a lot more intuitive. It's the stuff that we've been like showing stuff around what I've been doing now. I'm like, this is exactly what we've been trying to articulate, but you have to hold a few different tools to do this.
How do you deal with saving some entities from module, which also has dependencies or relations into other modules?
What do you mean?
You've shown the data diagram, and it actually looked pretty streamlined, like just a series of modules or services or whatever steps it's called, I don't know.
Yeah.
But sometimes it could be the case that one entity actually could be represented in two pieces, could have two pieces. The most the example from my domain is actually when you're buying a fitness application, a subscription fitness application, you could have nutrition plan and workout program, or just workout program, or just nutrition plan. And essentially, the purchase is actually happening in sales module.
Yeah.
How do you let know to other modules that actually purchase has happened? You need to generate a plan, etc., etc.
Yeah, well, you kind of, let me just repeat what you said. So understand, you've got like a sales module up here, which then you have a fitness module and a nutrition module. And in your sale, it may have both or one of fitness and nutrition. So I think the best way that we found in order to make the fitness module do something once the sales module has triggered a sale is events. So
that's exactly what I wanted to listen, because you have mentioned this, like domain events is a very important concept, which helps a lot to figure out how all this stuff will be working in real environment. Yeah.
And that's sort of like the next step. We're not there yet because we're still just moving code from one folder to another and tracking it wherever my graph went at the end here.
Again, there are.
But yeah, that's like the next step that we've been looking at of like you make your sales module fire an event of like sale was made, it includes fitness, it includes nutrition, and then your nutrition module subscribes to that event and does something. Your fitness module subscribes to that event and does something. We've just got like 2 places in the code base that actually do that yet because everything is still spaghetti at the moment.
Again, like biggest offender is doctrine relationships, and that you can just walk through dependency tree. So like the examples, like the step on a workflow has got various different properties on it. There's actually like
no need to attach the whole entity to the event.
No, I'm not talking about it. I'm talking about like this is like the fundamentally the thing that hurts the most about what we're doing. Like the leading cause of all the pain comes from the fact that you can walk that tree, because as I said, like the workflow step has like there's technically 4 or 5 different ways that step can finish, and there's basically a bunch of heuristic rules as to then how to calculate which step is currently up to and stuff, which to be fair should have been stored in the database table with the current step is, but it's another point. We want to make changes there, and you're like, okay, I've got all these properties of like when it was approved or the outcome, there's different properties on there. I want to make changes to it. So you come in and click in PHP style, like, where is this being used? And you find like some function that does calculate the logic for you. Like, sweet, it's all in one place. But actually, like, you then go like, well, where did that get called from? Because you can just load through all these different relationships, you kind of don't know which HTTP controller fundamentally is starting loading all these database relations to get there. And so it's fine when you're like working on a single record. So you're on like the page of this one tray, and it does fundamentally a join. And it's slow, but you're dealing with one of them. But then you go to procurement manager, which has 40 trades, 50 trades, 200 trades, and those like N+1s become absolutely chaotic. And you're trying to just track them all down. So like you're trying to cut off them first. And so even if you don't refactor fully to using events, but you put them through like a defined like that public interface, the public layer of your dev track sort of thing there, you at least know like if something is trying to call to get the latest workflow step, there's one place I go to, I can command click in PHP storm and it will tell me all the lines of code that actually ran in there, as opposed to going, well, I need to know who they call and who they call and who they call through a doctrine entity tree. That kind of makes sense. That's showing like actual code examples.
Do you use repository pattern? Like to fetch database?
Yeah, but again, if you have like some calculation logic, I've got an array of some items and I want to get the greatest or the least, or I don't know, the latest of these arrays, you might run a PHP function which you feed an array of these records and it spits it out, as opposed to pushing it to your database layer and optimizing into a repository path.
I mean, repository pattern helps to unbind from Python entities and use IDs between modules. That will help to figure out whether you have where do you need to request all of these entities, request all of them explicitly, like if you need to request by this ID vendors and all of them their steps or approvals or whatever relation it's called, you call it directly, you call the repository method exactly as it is, like get vendor div
We do
approvals
Yeah.
by ID. So and it sits in module repository, not in whole application repository, just in module repository. Then you clearly understand that this module makes these requests. Yeah, but still, obviously, I agree that lazy loading is still here and not you can prevent it. That's why in modules, you have. Sorry,
You can't prevent lazy loading in Doctor?
yeah, I assume so.
You can, but like really what you're describing is actually on a relationship, not having to get it to be able to fulfill the relationship. So you can't go from like we go a domain that I'm familiar with, like you can't go from like like an author to a book. You can't go from a book to an author. Like that sort of bit there. You've got the author object, and you go like get books, doing like a behind the scenes without you even noticing in Doctrine, just doing a select, left join sort of stuff. That's essentially the bit you're trying to cut off. So if that's going across a module, you just can't go author get books. You got to go through a public interface, through a repository method, those sort of things to be like, please give me the optimized way to do this, because that's where you just like walk the entire application.
It sounds like a real career milestone for you to have achieved this and learned and grown and like matured as developers through this process.
It's definitely, it does feel like leveling up like your architecture game, like your system architecture, like how you design things, and like having to face these sorts of problems. Like I've faced them before in a large code base that like had no tests and like no structure at all, and I was like a junior engineer and I had no idea how to deal with that, so I just made it worse. And then when we started like Hierarchy on ProcurePro, we tried to structure everything and test everything really well. So we've got quite a long way without feeling any pain of like everything's kind of still pretty good. And then it's not until the team gets big enough and the domain gets complex enough that you start feeling this sort of pain and you start looking around for solutions. Then once you find a solution with a large code base and a large team, you have to have a defined process in order to get towards that end goal. And it takes time.
Are you going to change approach in UI development for front end? Because ideally, module
we have started to as well, and like the front end is like defining their own modules, and they're following a similar pattern where you have like a front end, like you have specific components that are like common that everyone can use, and then you have components that are only for this domain. We did toy with the idea of tying like the front end components to a back end domain as well, and that just ended up being too hard.
I mean, whether front end consume different modules using different API endpoints, or you have some aggregated endpoints or federated endpoints, because some pages, like you've shown with the schedule, actually has information from multiple modules. How do you do this?
We generally use like a backend for front end. So like we have like an aggregate endpoint that like pulls things out of every module, joins it together, gives it to the front end. So like, yes, the front end reaches across the module boundaries in some aspects.
Somebody who work on this bit should be aware of the whole logic application.
Yes, exactly. But
My controversial take is that all the endpoints of the front end calls should only be to the module it belongs to. And so practically how that plays out is if you've got like you've got a trade that has a name and you have an endpoint to like update the name and you want to use that on 3 different pages, at the moment the default trade error would be like, oh sweet, we've got this one controller, like the trade name update controller, I'll call that for my 3 separate pages. My controversial idea that hasn't gotten off the ground is that doesn't make any sense. You actually have 3 separate controllers for 3 separate pages that they exist on, and they call to the domain layer of updating the name, because the endpoint only exists to service the front end, because like we have a front end that we communicate guidance, the only purpose it exists for. So I think the front end is intrinsically tied to the endpoints, and the endpoints are really just an interface for literally the UI to talk to it. But there should only be one way that you update the trade's name, which is like in the module that owns that entity that has the public method to do the thing. But there's separate interfaces to that, which are your HTTP endpoints. It just means that, yeah, like if you've got 2 pages, 3 pages to do the same thing, you create duplicate endpoints that might do theoretically the same thing.
With the same payload or different payload for different spaces?
This is the point. It's like you intuitively go, oh, they're going to be the same until they're not.
Okay,
So long as
then
there's
we
an underlying service which does the actual work and doesn't care what payload.
exactly. Then we comes to idea of not just modularizing, but also about layers. Because DevTrack, I'm not quite sure whether it was developed for modules, but it also could be used for splitting your architecture to presentation service, presentation layer, business logic layer, domain layer, application layer.
that is what DepTrack says it's for. I am bastardizing it to use it for what I want it for, but generally, like the way they pitch it is like you have a controller and a service and a repository, and you say that like your controller is allowed to talk to your service, your repository is not allowed to talk to your controller, and then I've just kind of used their layers to mean modules because that's the problem I wanted to solve. But you can use this sort of thing for like full DDD where you have like your actions and whatever else you have in DDD to enforce that things aren't calling like where they shouldn't be calling. But like long term, we do want to have like some way of enforcing the front end and make sure it only calls the endpoints that it's allowed to. But that's another kettle of fish that we haven't solved yet.
Well, I guess at that point, you really should, if you're expanding at that level, you're going to have lots of teams. So you're going to have a bunch of front-end teams and a bunch of back-end teams. And it's kind of where you get that all front-end and back-end convention. Build the front-end, give your requirements to the back-end team, kind of find out how do you want to, what APIs do you need to get. The back-end team will have their own architecture and they'll kind of decide what are we allowing, what are we not allowing, et cetera, et cetera.
We've specifically not done a back-end team and a front-end team, and we're structuring our team around the core domain concept for that reason. When we're delivering a feature, I don't want my front-end team like building the front end and then like handing over the requirements to the back end, and then you got to wait for the back-end team to schedule it amongst their priorities before the feature can get delivered. This is like a team that's cross-functional. Maybe they have a front-end developer and a back-end developer, or maybe everyone's full stack. Doesn't really matter, but they can build the whole thing without having to be like, okay, I've done my part. Now it's your problem to solve, and I'm washing my hands of it. That's something we're specifically trying to avoid because I've seen that before. But yeah, cool.
So you two ever disagree on architecture?
Hopefully.
Yeah, like all the time, I think. Tom's concept of like limiting what endpoints the front end can call, I initially disagreed with, and he's been slowly working on me over time to slowly convince me. But it's hard to enforce. It's hard to like actually have some tool, and like that's the thing that I want is some tool in CI that can tell an engineer when they're doing it the wrong way to make sure they do it the right way. Because Conway's law will tell you that, and there's other laws as well, that people will take the path of least resistance and they'll do whatever is easiest. And it's not that they're bad engineers, it's just that they're trying to do their job. They're trying to deliver value to customers, and I'm trying to put guardrails around what they do to make sure that they follow the general architecture that I want in the system.
Just generally make like it easy for them to do the right thing, because it's like it is through this conversation, you can see that it's a lot of like conjecture or like it's abstract, trying to understand how these things relate to each other. So you need to see physical examples of it. You need to do it a few times so that you're comfortable with it. And then like when you're doing things like defining module boundaries, you've got this one big name, not one, but you have all these namespaces, some of them that are way too big, have way too many cross-cutting concerns. And you now need to like teach these software engineers essentially architecture principles of like how to divide this up by a domain, because of like what are the rules that would make me go, that's clearly separated to that one, because that's not intuitive to everyone. So there's like a lot of like learning to be on there. So you need to be like kind. I think that's where like some of the front end stuff is like it's also just being realistic that there's a big code base that's there already. You can't just like change it overnight.
Yeah, but for example, before when we had higher IQ, we had a really nice structured code base. All the namespaces made sense. All the entities that were related were in the same namespace. And then we started talking about ProcurePro, and we're like, oh, ProcurePro, we didn't even have a name for ProcurePro at the time. We thought it was a construction plugin for higher IQ. So then we made this new namespace called construction, and we put all the construction related things in construction. And then that namespace got bigger and bigger and bigger until it was bigger than the rest of the code base combined. And then we're like, I think this is a new product. So then you go and delete everything that's not the construction namespace, and you have the construction namespace and the login page, and that's all we kept. And now everything's in this one namespace, and you're like, well, fuck. Like we had this nice structured code base before, and now it's all just like jammed into one folder.
We had a nice structured code base, but it's zero custom.
Yeah.
Is that right? Is that how it went wrong? Is that what forced your hand to go play?
The no customers, yeah, COVID did, because our customers were shopping centers, and
That's not a bit.
yeah. So we had one customer that signed up just before COVID, and they were still paying us money until the start of the year. When we started this year, when I finally shut down Hierarchy, it's been running this whole time. But yeah, we had a big sales pipeline of like a dozen customers that were going to come on the next 6 months, and then COVID hit. The people that were like we were talking to last week had been stood down without pay, and they didn't want to talk to us. So we're like, guess we'll try this construction thing.
It was really
But on the
fascinating.
plus side, 100% customer satisfaction.
Yeah.
Like they can fix like one bug in like 3-4 years, and they happily pay their invoice every month. So,
Yeah, I kind of like the idea of a profitable zombie project just sitting.
it was
Well,
profitable in the sense that it paid AWS, but it wasn't profitable in the sense that it had to pay our salary.
we spent 3 years of like 6 people building it, but like it covered its AWS bill, so it counts.
Oh, man.
It also had like very deprecated versions of many things.
Yeah.
The reason I would chose it now is MySQL.
Yeah,
deprecation on Aurora.
it was MySQL 5.6 or something, and AWS is like, no, you can't run that anymore. So they're sending me like,
Double cost.
yeah,
Yeah.
they're sending me
Right.
more and more like direct emails every month, like you need to shut this down or we're going to turn it off for you. I'm like, oh man,
No, we have a customer over there.
yeah, and I don't want to do that. I don't want to do the work to make it work on my
So there's, like,
CLA.
It's actually more work to do something about. Like, how you gotta send emails and like the customer like itself. It's like, oh, we could just pay for the next tier of extended support of AWS and wait another year to have the same conversation. At some point like that, it's a bit much.
I think AWS extended support finishes the end of this year, when like they won't even let you pay more for 5.6, I think. So then we had to get them off at some point, so we just chose Christmas time, and we're like, yeah, we did that for Redis. Like, so last year, about this time last year, AWS was sending us similar emails about our Redis from Hierarchy, being like, we're turning that off. So we spun up our own EC2 instance running a deprecated version of Redis to get past that.
Luckily for those 8 users, the challenge is pretty low, so the Redis cluster was stable.
Yeah. Yeah.
It wasn't still easy and like it does that. So we're like, we didn't want to like kick our customers off because we didn't have the good part, like, oh, just go to our competitor, because there was nothing there. Like, or else you keep it running as long as you keep paying. So
Even when I had the call with them, and they're like, oh, we really want to see this around. Do you know any, like, over the years, have you found another competitor that we could switch to? And I said, no, like, there's a couple of things that you might be able to use. And then like a few weeks later, they came back and were like, there's nothing. We've looked everywhere. We're just going back to emails and Word documents.
Oh, you guys killed a unicorn.
I know. Anyway, all the other customers.
Only had one.